Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Brentwood Backing Business webinar, the very first webinar on behalf of Brentwood Chamber of Commerce, Brentwood Business Partnership, and Brentwood Borough Council. My name is Colin Barber. I'm the chairman of Brentwood Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to host today's webinar. I also run a business called The Management Mechanic, working as a trainer, coach, and business consultant. Our presenter today is Chris Bushell, who is also a business consultant, and I'd like to thank him for joining us today. I'd also like to thank you for joining us today and for supporting this very first webinar. Hope you enjoy it and hope you find it very useful. We have worked together at the Chamber of Commerce. We have worked together before with Brentwood Business Partnership and Brentwood Borough Council on various training projects, but obviously with the coronavirus crisis, we weren't able to run the traditional training courses, so we've turned to webinars as a way of helping support you, the businesses, to keep your businesses running in Brentwood during this difficult time. Just a little bit about how the actual webinar works. You as viewers are muted unless we do ask you to talk to us. So the default position for it is that you are muted. There is a chat option. So if you want to say anything to myself or Chris, then do feel free to fire off something in the chat section. And there's also a Q&A section whereby if you've got a question, which in fact we would very much like you to have a question, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask Chris, then just type the question, and at the end we can run through the questions and hopefully answer all your questions. Just one point on that, we will, unless you say otherwise, I will just read out the name of the person asking the question. But if you'd like to remain anonymous, just type anonymous at the start of your question, and I'll just read it out as an anonymous question. The webinar is being recorded, so if you don't get a chance to watch it all, or if you just want to recap on some of the points, then feel free to do so. We'll send out the link to the recording later on today. And also I understand from Chris that he will be, if you want, he will be able to supply you with some PowerPoint details of the presentation today as well. So also I'd like to thank Chris Bushell, our presenter today, for joining us. And Chris, are you there? Good morning.
I am. Good morning, all.
Chris. Good morning. So first of all, Chris, I know you're from Smart Support, Clever Business Thinking. Just tell us very quickly a little bit about Smart Support and what you do.
Certainly. Well, Smart Support's been in existence now for around about 10 years. During that time, we're a small partnership. We're based in Essex and Kent, and we help business owners to grow their businesses in whatever way they need to do. The big challenge for an awful lot of small business owners is that while they're very, very good at what they do with their in doing what they do in their business, sometimes they struggle with how to make that work and make a success of it. We've got quite a reasonable track record over the last years of improving the lives of the business owners, which is what it's all about, really. So that's what we do, Colin.
Okay, and I think it's always interesting, Chris, just tell us a little bit more about your background before Smart Support. You also had a few years in business yourself. Tell us what you did just very briefly.
Certainly. Well, back in the dim, distant past, I was an IT director for a small multinational that leased containers to the shipping industry. As IT director, I became part of the group which got involved in mergers and acquisitions because the company grew quite dramatically as a result of acquisition, and I became part of the due diligence team. What happened there was that I discovered, by the time I'd spent a few years doing acquisitions, that I knew quite a lot more about how businesses work than just about how the IT would support them. So when I had a career change, which was as I say, quite some years ago now, I found that this was something that I felt I could do quite well, and certainly I think quite a lot of my clients agree with me.
Good. Right. Okay. So just to remind our audience today, if you do have any questions for Chris, then just hit the Q&A button, which is probably at the bottom of your screen, depending on the format, and type in the message and just let me know whether you want to remain anonymous or not, and we'll hopefully deal with all those questions. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to share a screen so that we can actually all see And as Colin, you're the only person I can talk to. Can you now see the screen?
I can, Chris. Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Jolly good, jolly good. Okay, so thanks a lot, everybody, for joining us today. The idea of this particular event is to talk about how crisis management can be managed during most business issues, as it were. I was talking to a friend of mine at the beginning of March, at the end of March, and his comment to me was, I've had the 90-day trial for 2020, and I don't think I'm going to subscribe. And if you think about it, that's quite a challenge that we've had lately. Last year it was Brexit, and everybody got really, really fed up of that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in a moment. And then who remembers the floods that happened in January and February? All of a sudden, that's old news, isn't it? And yet that caused a lot of problems, both personally and for businesses across the UK. So how do we run our businesses during times of crisis like this? Today, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to help us get an understanding of the challenges that we face, explore how best to manage those challenges, and then to identify and deal with the loss-making areas of our business. Come up with some ideas about how we focus on short-term priorities, and then develop an action plan to get us through the situation. We'll also look at where we might be able to go to get some help as well, which I think is quite an important element of all of this. I think one thing to remember is that we're all in this together. Your clients are quite often your suppliers, or if it's a bit incestuous sometimes. Those people who are your clients are somebody else's suppliers, and so on down the track. And so we do really have to remember that we really are all in this together. So how did we end up here? Well, I like to think of running a business as being on a bit of a journey. And if you think about the way that this works, you have a set of goals when you start, and your aim is to try and get to those goals as quickly as you possibly can. Along the way, waves crash and wind blows, and before you know it, you're getting blown off course by all those little things around your business. Rising costs, new technology, external influences of one sort and another, a new supplier, a competitor turning up on your doorstep. All these sorts of things can knock you off track. But if you've got a decent business plan before you start, you can understand where you're going, and you can put yourself back on track from there. As I mentioned earlier on in my introduction, a lot of the people that I deal with are people who get blown off course effectively and can't necessarily work out how to get back on track. And now, of course, what we've got coronavirus, and coronavirus is giving us all sorts of hassles, not only in our daily lives, but it's making us concerned about our futures, both in personal terms and also in terms of our businesses. And if you think about it, after all the hassles that we've had over the last 3 or 4 years with Brexit, causing all sorts of challenges across businesses, where we thought we got past that when we got to December the 12th. At least we knew where we were going to go. And coronavirus has come back and done it to us all again. In our businesses, we have quite a lot to do in order to react to this. We've got to safeguard our clients. We've got to safeguard our staff in their normal working day if they're still operating. We've got to put contingencies in place for our staff members get infected and so on, and have to go off and self-isolate. But the one common thread that we've all suffer is that we have to have sufficient cash to get through the crisis, which I suspect is going to be quite long term. It's not going to be over in the next few months. We are going to be in a situation which is going to be a bit longer term than that. I think it can be overwhelming, and that's part of the challenge that we have here. Typically, when we're running our businesses, all we're concerned about is growth and profit. And now all of a sudden, we're thinking about cash and survival. So what are the effects, and how can we overcome them? I thought I'd do a very, very brief case study with you, just to give you an idea of where the money might go within your business. So here we are, we've got a company called Acme Widget Company. I have no idea what a widget is, but we always seem to have them, so let's go with there. We've got a turnover here of £600,000 with a gross profit of 300, and after our overheads of 100,000, we're making a net profit of £200,000. That's not too bad. The business is okay. It's making quite a substantial amount of money. It's a little bit cash intensive, as you'll see at the bottom, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's not dissimilar to the sort of businesses that I find myself working with on a fairly regular basis. Now, quite often people will put this into a profit and loss model, but what I'm going to do today is incorporate these numbers into a simple cash modeling tool, which looks a bit like this. Now, if I just steer you through the numbers for a moment, up here in the top left-hand corner, we've got a blue box showing revenue, which is £600,000. And underneath it, we've got another blue box, which shows £300,000 of cost of goods, giving us our gross profit of 300. After our overheads in this blue box in the middle, that means that we end up with a net profit, or an earnings before interest and tax, of £200,000. And that's what your profit and loss report would show you. And that's that £200,000 is the number that HMRC are interested in, because that's the number that they're going to tax you on. However, there are some underlying numbers in your business that not everybody really thinks about an awful lot of the time. As I mentioned before, up here on the top right, we've got another blue box with £85,000 worth of accounts receivable. That means £85,000 is owed to the business by our customers. And if you look at the little red box on the right-hand side of that, you'll see that the debtor days is around about 50. That means that our customers are taking 50 days to pay their bills. If you actually think that most people have 30-day credit terms, then that means, frankly, they're taking a little bit of a liberty. In the middle here, we've got a stock value of 120,000, which means that if we've got stock on the shelf of £120,000, over a revenue of £600,000, on average, we turn our stock 5 times a year, which means it's sitting on the shelf for more than 2 months of the year. Now, I know that not all the businesses that are listening today are businesses that actually manufacture stuff and physically have stuff on the shelf. But if you're in a service industry, the equivalent of stock is work in progress. I'm sure we've all got work in progress. That's one where we haven't actually invoiced it yet. So just think, that actual model still works for you in a service environment. But the big thing here is that with that £85,000 at the top of the page, the 120 underneath, and I'm going to knock off £20,000 because we owe £20,000 to other people that we haven't yet paid them, we've got a required working capital of £185,000. Now, what that means is that we need that sort of money in the business in order for it to continue running. And if you think about it, if we're maintaining a stock of £120,000, for instance, it wouldn't take long if we didn't have that money sitting in the business before we ran out of cash. So if, as a model, we subtract the 185 from the £300,000 gross profit, we end up with a marginal cash flow of 115,000, and after our overheads of 100,000, we actually end up with a net variable cash flow of £15,000. Now, that £15,000 is the cash that's generated by the business after financing the costs which it's got within the business. And I'm sure we've all heard of businesses that on paper are making quite a lot of money in terms of profit, and then they go out of business. And this is the reason why, because despite the fact that there's quite a nice net profit there, the cash flow, the net variable cash flow, is actually not as great. £15,000 is still positive though, which is the most important thing. But what then happens if something like coronavirus arrives overnight, which is pretty much what it's done? Let's assume for a moment that our revenue has dropped to 300,000 a year. we're still only buying 50%. The cost of goods is still only 50% of our revenue. So we end up with a gross profit of £150,000, which gives us a net profit down here at the bottom on the left of £50,000. So the tax man will still want his 20% of that 50,000. But on the right-hand side, on the assumption that we haven't been able to do anything about the fact that our debtors still owe us £85,000, and we've still got the stock on the shelves because we had it there last week of £120,000, we've still got £185,000 of required working capital. If you deduct that from the 150,000 gross profit, then knock off your overheads, it means that your net variable cash flow is negative. Not only is it negative, it's very big and negative. Now, what that means is this business would now run out of cash very, very quickly. It doesn't matter that you've got a £50,000 net profit, you're still going to run out of cash. So what can we do? Well, obviously, we have to do something about these numbers on the top right-hand side. If we were to call in the debts that are owed to us so that our debtor days are closer to that £30,000, that 30 days that we're talking about, we'd end up with accounts receivable of £30,000. If we actually reduced the amount of stock on the shelf and replenished it more frequently, then actually we could reduce our stock level to £30,000. I'm not going to move that £20,000 cash at the moment, creditors at the moment. I'm just going to leave it there. But what that means then is that our required working capital is £40,000. If we shave a little bit off our overheads as well, 5%, what does that mean? Reduce the amount of stationery we use, reduce the amount of waste in the business, a couple of other things like that. It shouldn't be hard to reduce our overheads by 5%. We end up with a net variable cash flow again of £15,000. That is, of course, the same number that we started with before coronavirus came on. Okay, there we are then. We've got a business that's stable again. But what if our revenue really did fall off a cliff and we go to the point where we've only got £150,000 worth of revenue? Same model on the left-hand side, we're still making a net profit. If we align our accounts receivable value by maintaining our 30-odd debtor days, and if we align our stock value to the amount that we're selling as well, our required working capital drops dramatically. Now, of course, that still at this stage wouldn't necessarily be enough. But if you think that the £95,000 of overheads that we had initially was there to service a £600,000 revenue, then we should be able to make some reductions in our overheads as well. If we could get the overheads down to 60,000, we've got a positive net variable cash flow again, which means that there's money coming into the business rather than going out of it. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that that's easy. Most of the time, a lot of the cost within a business like this would be staff. So the likelihood is that's staff redundancies perhaps, or losing staff in other ways. And we'll come on to that later in the presentation. So it's not an easy thing to do, but nevertheless, if we don't do it, the business will go to the wall. So what are we going to have to do? Well, the first thing we need to do is actually to eliminate the emotion. It's quite normal to be angry and upset about what's going on, especially at a time like this, when actually it's none of your doing. Nothing here is your cause. But it's important to park those emotions. The emotions are there because the business quite often is our baby. We built this business up from scratch, and it's our passion, it really is. But at this time, we've got to be objective with our decisions. And unless we are objective, then we will make poor decisions. The next thing to do is to stop the bleeding. Concentrate on where the business is losing money at the moment. Deal with that first. Just stop the leak. Once you can stop the leak, you can then sit back and think a little bit more about what the business is good at, what brings in the most money, what brings in the most cash into the business. and think about how you can leverage that going forward. And of course, the way to do that is to have a battle plan for your business. Now, I'm sure you're aware that if you've got a plan and you don't use that plan, then actually there's no point in having the plan in the first place. I come across a lot of people who initially did a business plan for their bank so that they could borrow some money when they started the business up, and then never looked at the plan ever again, and then wonder why their business doesn't do as well as they hoped. So not only do you have to have a plan, but you've got to use it. And it's good to get help, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth as well. So what are the main points? Well, first of all, we're going to set and review some budgets. Use those budgets to determine whether or not you're achieving against the aims that you put in place in the first place. Then we're going to optimize cash flow, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in a few moments. Review your costs. Obtain funding if you need it. The government is guaranteeing bank loans at the moment, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth later. Explore that help that's available to you. That could be your accountant, it could be a business advisor, and I know that there are at least 2 other business advisors on this call, so I'm not just talking about me here, but talk to your accountant, talk to a business advisor, understand what's going on. And of course, people like the Chamber and so on are doing all the things they can to provide help going forwards. I know that the Brentwood Council are distributing quite a lot of money to support the government support schemes at the moment. And lastly, maximize your existing clients, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in a moment too. So, budgets. Firstly, put a budget together based on what you might expect to happen as a result of the position that you find yourself in. Include the sales you know about and include the costs associated with making those sales. Put together a profit and loss forecast for the next 13 weeks. Once you've got that profit and loss forecast, take that information and turn it into a rolling weekly cash flow for that same period. Once you've got that rolling cash flow and knowing what money's going to come in and knowing what money's going to go out, you'll actually be able to identify the hotspots, not only how much money you're going to need to put into the business, but also when you're going to need to do it. Once you've put those budgets and those estimates together, use them. Compare them with actuals on a week-by-week basis. Adjust them if they're wrong. One thing that that is really out there is that a budget is just another word for an estimate, and an estimate is another word for a guess. So sometimes we guess wrong. If your budget doesn't work, if it doesn't reflect reality, or if you've not been able to achieve the savings that you thought you were going to save, then adjust your budget accordingly. That way, at least you'll know in advance when the problems are going to occur. I've said 2 budgets up there, and the best thing to do is first of all to put up there what you think you're going to achieve, and underneath then develop a worst case scenario. The worst case scenario will tell you whether or not this business has got legs going forwards, regardless of what gets thrown at it. Optimize your cash flow. Invoice quickly. Chase your debts. Some people find chasing debts really quite difficult. I have a view which says, well, if that money is in your bank account instead of in mine, it's supporting your cash flow rather than supporting mine, which ultimately means that your business is more likely to survive than mine. So wouldn't it be a good idea if you gave me that money, as after all, you owe it to me? I find it a lot easier to galvanize, to ask people for money under those circumstances. Pay your creditors more slowly if you possibly can. But before you do that, talk to them. Negotiate with your landlords. Negotiate with suppliers. Negotiate with the people that you're borrowing money from. Ask for payment holidays. And make sure that you maintain the relationship with those people as you go along. Whatever you do, don't pay before the due date. Only ever pay at the last possible moment, and obviously you need to respect their positions as well. Reduce the amount of stock you've got in the business. If you've got stock that's been sitting on the shelf for some time, shift it, get rid of it, get what you can for it. Remember, if that stock's been on the shelf for a significant amount of time, you've probably already recorded the cost of it in your losses. So anything you get for it going forwards is better than nothing, especially when you've got to focus on cash. And lastly, avoid paying HMRC if you possibly can. As you know, VAT, you don't have to pay your VAT payment between April and June. You've got until next March to pay that. But here's a little hint. If you're like a lot of businesses and you actually normally pay your VAT on direct debit, cancel that direct debit now, because otherwise what will happen is HMRC will assume that you're happy to pay your VAT now, and they will take the money. Manage your costs. Only buy what you need to buy. Renegotiate with suppliers. Can you negotiate pricing changes with your supplier? You may be able to get a short-term price change just because they know that you're going to struggle otherwise. Be reasonable in what you ask for, but don't be afraid to ask. Remember, it's not in their interest that you go bust, because at the end of the day, their revenue will drop as a result of that. Ask for payment holidays if you can. Focus on the big costs in your business. Salaries, well, we all know that that's an emotive subject too, but salaries, obviously, vehicles, rent, potentially marketing and sales. I'm not suggesting you stop marketing. I'm suggesting you review what marketing you do during this time when sales potentially are going to be low anyway. Seek additional funding. Lender funding. Talk to the people that you already borrow from. See if there's any way of gaining additional money. Potentially inject new funds in yourself if you can, although I would caution to put a charge on any money that you put into the business, just in case the worst happens. Sell any assets that are unused at the moment. If you've got a spare van that's sitting in the corner just in case, then you don't need it at the moment, because you've probably got more vans than you need anyway. And of course, government support. Levels of government support at the moment are huge. In the words of Rishi, unprecedented measures for unprecedented times. There's lots of government help out there. I'm not going to go through this today. If you go to the gov.uk website, you'll find all of the information you need here. I believe it's also on the links to it are certainly on the Federation Small Businesses website and elsewhere. Go through the list of all the things that are available, identify the ones that you might be eligible for, find out how to avail yourself of those funds, and then go ahead and do it. And specifically, obviously, there are the business interruption loans. I know they've got a bit of a bad press at the moment, but it doesn't stop you from trying. Encourage sales. What do I mean by that? Well, really, I'm saying keep a close eye on your customers. Make sure that they are as well as they possibly can be. Keep in touch with them. Support them if you can. Be a friend to them, and if you can find ways where you can provide additional services to them, then do that if you possibly can. Make sure that you stay relevant to them, I think is the point that we're talking about there. I think the one thing that is very, very obvious, that there are going to be business casualties. So be aware of what's going on in your market. It could be that you can help people who are already in the market that are struggling. But ultimately, of course, it could be that it could be additional customers out there if a prior competitor of yours doesn't survive. So we've done all of this stuff. We've planned. We've identified where we're going. What if it's not enough? I think the big point here is, if you've got a decent understanding of how your cash is working, you'll get lots of advance notice of whether or not you really are in difficulty. And if you are in difficulty, there are lots of options. And my point here is, get professional advice early. Talk to advisors, accountants, insolvency practitioners. All of these people have got tools that can help them help you in various ways to achieve what you need to achieve to get through this. And let's face it, some of us might not be here in a year's time with the in professional terms. So we're in a crisis. There's nothing we can do to change that. We can only do the things that we can do. Control what you can, focus on the things that you can control, and make sure that you're focusing on the things that you can control, which are the right things. This is a long haul. It's not going to be a 3-month effort. There's tougher times ahead for everybody. So let's just make sure that we can, we've got control over the things that we can do. And finally, as I said earlier on, we're all somebody else's supplier. We're all somebody else's customer. So please look after each other and be reasonable in what you request of those other people. Colin, have we got any questions today?
Yes, Chris. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much. Very informative presentation, and just also to reiterate to the audience, you do have certainly at least one question, but if you do have any other questions of any nature, then feel free to type them in. I always say to people, you might have a question that you think is a stupid question, but often the stupid ones are the best ones, and probably everyone else that's watching today might well have the same question. It might be something that Chris has just forgotten to mention, or something that you want him to clarify. So do fire away with your questions. In the meantime, I'll ask you the first one, which is one that probably quite a few of you people watching today can relate to, and it's certainly one that people have mentioned to me. And it reads, Chris, it's quite a long one, but it's quite self-explanatory. Like many limited company directors, I pay myself via a combination of salary and dividend. I am aware of the loan schemes available to small businesses, but do not want to be forced down this route. Obviously, the loan schemes, any loan has to be paid back at some stage. With self-employed equivalents being able to furlough themselves and carry on working, it seems as if company directors of very small SMEs have fallen between the cracks in the Chancellor's plans. Are you aware of any pressure being brought to bear on the Chancellor to change his support plans for directors of small companies?
Well, now that's a very good question. I'm sure there are quite a few of us who are in that boat, and the answer is I'm not aware that any pressure is coming to fruition. I think that's the best way to say that. I know that I'm pretty sure that Federation of Small Businesses are actually looking at lobbying the government on this one. I think my personal view, to be honest, is that if there was going to be any support for company directors who are in this trap, then we would already know about it. We found out about the job retention scheme fairly quickly after it all started. The self-employed scheme, I think, came out a week, 2 weeks later, something like that. I think if there was anything in mind, I think we'd probably have heard about it by now. And to be honest, we don't have time to wait. If something comes out, then we are going to be in a position where there's going to be a gap in terms of cash flow for all our businesses between now and then. I seem to recall the question said, I don't really want to look at the business interruption loan scheme. I think if this was a 3-month, 4-month challenge, then I could see why people would be reticent about that. But at the end of the day, I think we are on a longer treadmill here. And that means that we are going to have to find ways to finance, well, our lives really, rather than just our businesses during the forthcoming future. To take the point, you could furlough yourself as a director. You would only actually get 80% of the bit that you put in as salary, which is probably about £800 a month. So you'd probably only see around about 650. The one thing that you're allowed to do as a company director, there are, I believe, 6 statutory duties that a company director is allowed to perform, or is required to perform. And the government has said that you can furlough yourself as a director and still operate within your business in order to exercise those statutory duties. It's open to interpretation what those statutory duties can amount to. But for instance, if you were, I don't know, paying your payroll, chances are that would be regarded as an operational activity, and therefore you would disqualify yourself. Ultimately, I know I did go onto a webinar last week, and I was reminded that you can, at this stage, because you are somebody who is struggling always round, you can apply for universal credit. You can only apply for universal credit if you've got, I think it's less than £16,000 personal savings. So to all intents and purposes, like it or not, and I'm amongst this category, and I'm sure there's quite a few who are nodding to themselves at the moment. Yeah, we're in this on our own for a little while at least. So just keep thinking about ways in which you can support yourself across those ways. Does that help?
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, very detailed answer. I would probably agree with everything you've said. Well, I would agree with everything you've said. I'd also like to add Laurie Edmonds, who is Economic Development Manager at Brentwood Borough Council and has been very involved in the distribution of grants through the council. She's one of our audience today. She's watching the webinar, and she's just sent me a message whilst you were talking. You'll be pleased to hear the first thing she says is Chris is absolutely right. And she's saying that the FSB, the Institute of Directors, British Chamber of Commerce, Enterprise Nation, etc., are all lobbying on for this, but there's no further announcements as of this morning. I'd also like to add to that we in Brentwood Chamber of Commerce have had several people contacting us on this point, and we're collecting case studies to forward on to both to Laurie and also to Alex Burkhardt, our MP, so that he can potentially lobby. I know you said a lot of the grants have already been decided, but inevitably, I guess, in a situation like this, there are going to be, I think, cracks in the platform, falling between the cracks, as our questioner put it. And so there's still a possibility that something might happen, but obviously that doesn't necessarily help if, as you've been talking about, if people have got cash flow problems.
And I think one of the things that I've discovered, I've spent the last few weeks putting together cash flow plans for my clients, and there are two gaps. There are 2 points where cash flow tends to be a bit of a challenge. One is this coming month, because most of the money that's coming in for the self-employed scheme and also the job retention scheme is not happening until the end of April at the very earliest, and in the case of the self-employed scheme, a lot later. So I think a lot of people are going to be suffering with cash problems now, as it were. The other time, one or two of my clients, we've actually speculatively identified what's going to happen when we come out at the back end of whatever's going on now. And that's the other time at which cash flow potentially can be a challenge, because what happens is you have to start buying goods again, you have to start paying salaries, but you don't got to start getting paid for another month and a half. So typically those are the 2 gaps that you've got. Even if you've got a short-term solution, you're likely to have a cash flow issue now, and you'll certainly have one as we start to come out of all of this, whenever that might be.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Just one small point. I noticed on the screen we've got any questions, and we also got, Chris, your email address below that. So you might be receiving questions by email, but I just want to emphasise to our audience today, if you've got any questions which you'd like to be answered right now here in this webinar, then please do use the Q&A button in your Zoom meeting menu bar to type in a question now, and then we can answer that now. Obviously, if you do send a question to Chris via email, I'm sure he will answer it, but it would be useful if you have any questions that you want answering today, just to ping them through using the Q&A button. We haven't got any further questions at the moment, but it's a good opportunity for me to talk about our next webinar, which is happening next Tuesday, Tuesday the 21st of April, same time, 9:30 a.m, similar sort of duration, depending, of course, on how many questions we've got. And the title of the next webinar is Ask HR, Furlough and Any Other Employment Queries. So you may be an employee watching today, an employee, you may be an employer, or you may just generally have some questions regarding to HR issues. And our presenter for that seminar is Lindsay Salmon, and she's a HR consultant who's been working in HR for many years, and she can answer any of your questions regarding the coronavirus job retention scheme or various other things. So anything from a HR point of view, she'll be able to talk about the legal implications and how to get around those. So it's next Tuesday. Registration in the same way, details will be on the Chamber of Commerce website, and we hope to see you for that one next Tuesday. In the meantime, I'm just checking again to see if we have any questions. So I guess that means, Chris, that you've done a very, very thorough job in presenting all that information, because we've got no further questions. Is there anything you wanted to add, Chris, before we wrap things up?
Well, only to say thanks for listening today. If you do have any questions which come up, and let's face it, these things often come up immediately afterwards. We've just had a question, actually, I think.
We have,
then please get in touch. I'll be more than happy to answer that. I'm more than happy to have a chat if anybody feels the need for that as well. And remember, there are a number of business advisors within the chamber. And so, you know, there are a number of us out there who I'm sure will be able to help you at this time if you feel the need. Okay.
Right, Chris. Well, actually, in fact, whilst you've been talking, we've got two questions, so I'll quickly fire them at you. First of all, one of them you mentioned about VAT and not necessarily paying VAT. And this one says, I'm due to pay corporation tax at the end of July. Should I try to pay small amounts each month?
Certainly talk to HMRC about this. They do have a time to pay scheme, and the way in which that will work will vary from business to business, but they are the people who will be able to tell you what you can and can't achieve. Or are you talking here about corporation tax which is not yet due? Is that the question?
The question says I'm due to pay it at the end of July, so I'm not quite sure whether that means it's due. Yeah. I guess that's, yeah, payment is due at the end of July. Yeah. In that case, yes. Time to pay is the solution. Talk to HMRC. They should be able to give you a schedule that you can work to. Okay, good, thank you. The next question is more of a general question, I guess. Is there a way that local businesses can network remotely with a view to seeing if and where we might be able to support each other? Obviously that's something which is going on quite a lot. Most of the networking groups I'm aware of are networking still in some form or other. Indeed, at the Chamber of Commerce, we had our very first networking group yesterday lunchtime, which was very popular and very successful. So I would suggest that if you look for the normal sources of networking, then you will find that most organisations are still networking remotely. I know here at the Chamber of Commerce we're planning to hold remote video networking twice a week, and again, details on our website. Anything you want to add to that, Chris? No, I think you've answered that one perfectly. Thank you. Right. Okay. Good. So just double check we've got no further questions. No, that's all for the moment. So all that remains really is for me to thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. Just to, as I did say at the beginning, I think you did mention, Chris, that if someone wants a copy of these slides, is that something you can arrange? Yes, just email me and I'll send them out. Okay, so if you email Chris at the address on the screen now, he'll be happy to send you a copy of the slides. We are recording today's webinar, so if you weren't able to log on right from the beginning, I know there were a couple of participants who joined us a little bit later, and or indeed if you would just like to go through the whole presentation again, then do look out for a link to the recording, which we'll be publicising through the various social media channels. So don't forget, next Tuesday with Lindsay Salmon, and hope you have all things go well for you between now and then. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks very much, Chris. See you again soon. Bye. Bye-bye.